How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the Stage 2 playoff picture. We're heading into the final week of Stage 2, and there's 11 teams who still have a chance to secure one of the 3 spots still up for grabs. Not only that, but the seeding of the teams who have already qualified for the playoffs have yet to be set in stone. The final week of Stage 2 holds at least some importance for more than half of the teams in the league. The fate of many of these teams are going to come down to how they perform, as well as how their competition does too. It'll be my job to explain what each of these teams need to happen in order to earn a playoff spot, or to find out where they're placed in terms of seeding. Let's start with the top teams in the league who have already qualified to see what they have to do to earn the highest playoff seeding possible. So starting off with the Gladiators, they're currently in first place this stage with a 6-0 record and a plus 12 map differential. That's pretty solid if I do say so myself. But if the Gladiators want to be the number 1 seed, then they'll first need to beat the Boston Uprising this Friday. They're also going to need both the Shock and the Titans to lose one of their next 2 games. It would be mathematically impossible for the Gladiators to finish in first if the Shock or Titans go 7-0 because they both have a map differential far greater than the Gladiators. Even a clean 4-0 sweep over the Uprising wouldn't be enough to close the gap. Unfortunately for the Gladiators, the likelihood of the Shock or the Titans losing a game is very small since they're very clearly the 2 best teams in the league right now and their week 5 schedules look relatively easy. It sucks to potentially have an undefeated stage and not get rewarded as much as you'd like, but all the Gladiators have to do is win and they'll guarantee themselves a spot in the top 3. But even if they lose their final game, they're still guaranteed to finish somewhere in the top 6, so you should be feeling pretty good if you're a Gladiators fan right now. Up next, we have the San Francisco Shock, and this team is looking like they're in pretty good shape to finish with that number 1 seed. They're currently 5-0 with a plus 20 map differential. This team looks nearly unstoppable right now, and with how they've been playing lately, it's hard to believe they won't continue this kind of dominance coming into their final 2 games. They find themselves going up against the Fusion and the Dragons, and it's really difficult to believe they're not going to win both of those games pretty easily. The Shock are in the driver's seat. They control their own destiny. If they can 4-0 at least one of their opponents this week and win the other game, then they'll be able to lock up the number 1 seed. A plus 25 map differential, or maybe even more, with a 7-0 record would guarantee them to get it, since the Titans can only get a plus 24 at best by 4-0ing both of their opponents. All the Shock have to do is take care of business the way they have been, and that number 1 seed is as good as theirs. The current 3rd place team is the Vancouver Titans, and they also look to be in a pretty good position to finish in first or second, kind of like with the Shock. They're actually guaranteed to finish that high so long as they win both of their games this week. And with their final 2 opponents of the stage being a struggling Defiant squad and the Dynasty who they've already beaten twice, I'd say that things are looking pretty good for them right now. But if the Titans want to lock up the number 1 seed for a second stage in a row, then they're not only going to need to win both of their games, but also have the Shock either lose or not win either of their final 2 matches 4-0. Even 2 3-1 victories would put the Titans in a position to snag the top spot away from them. If these conditions are met by the Shock and Vancouver is able to clean sweep both of their opponents, then that would allow them to finish with the same win-loss record, map record, and map differential. And if there's a tie in all of these categories, then the next tiebreaker would be head-to-head record, and since the Titans defeated the Shock during stage 1, they would technically be ahead in the standings. And even if the Titans were for some reason to just get blown out in both of their games, it wouldn't even matter because they're still in a safe place regardless, like with the Shock and the Gladiator, since they're guaranteed to finish somewhere in the top 6. Coming in at the number 4 spot right now is the NYXL. They too have a top 6 spot in the playoffs guaranteed since their record and map differential is just so darn good. They also technically could finish somewhere in the top 3, but they'll need to win the rematch game against the Atlanta Reign and get some help from the other teams that are ahead of them right now. If the Gladiators lose and New York wins, then they'll automatically pass them in the standings since they'd have the better map differential. They could also pass both the Titans and the Shock if they lose at least one of their final 2 games each. New York would more than likely also need to pull off a 4-0 against the Reign and have both the Shock and Titans underperform pretty badly this week. It doesn't matter how it happens, as long as the NYXL win the tiebreaker, they still could technically finish in first. It's also worth noting that the NYXL currently have a leg up on the Shock since they beat them during stage 1. So if a tiebreaker between these 2 teams comes down to head-to-head record, then technically the NYXL would be able to climb above them. But on the other hand, since the Titans have not played the NYXL yet, a final decision tiebreaker for them would come down to an offline match, with the first team getting the 3 map wins being the victor, or a coin toss. It all depends on how they wanted to settle it. Oh, and in case you were wondering, that's how a final tiebreaker works for any 2 teams. If they just so happen to have an identical win-loss record, map differential, and head-to-head record, then those are the 2 ways teams can settle a tiebreaker between one another to decide playoff seeding. Our final team to have already clinched a playoff berth and guarantee themselves a top 6 finish is the London Spitfire. Technically, London can still make the number 1 seed as well, but they need a whole lot of luck on their side. If they wanted to have a guaranteed top finish, then they need everyone in front of them right now to lose, and they'll also need to 4-0 the Outlaws. I would say that the Shock are definitely the biggest roadblock for the Spitfire right now, though, since the Shock would have to lose both of their games in order for the Spitfire to pass them. Their map differential is just simply too good right now. Even if they got 4-0'd in a loss and just barely won the other game, the Shock would still be too much for the Spitfire to overcome. Now let's take a look at the playoff hopefuls. We'll first talk about the teams who would be in the playoffs if they started today, then move on to the ones on the outside looking in. Since the likelihood of these teams facing a tough opponent are extremely high, I'm going to almost strictly focus on what these teams need to have happen in order to get in. Playoff seeding doesn't matter nearly as much here, since these teams will more than likely be facing off against opponents who are significantly better than them regardless of where they finish. So starting off with the current number 6 seed is the Dallas Fuel. This team has put themselves in a really good position to make the stage playoffs after performing exceptionally well during the Dallas homestand over the weekend. Can we just take a moment to appreciate how awesome this event was before moving forward? Seriously, the atmosphere of it was absolutely incredible and has a lot of fans really excited for the Atlanta home games during Stage 3. But anyway, all Dallas has to do is win their game against the Florida Mayhem and they'll be in. They've put themselves in the exact same position they did last stage. Hopefully the Fuel don't choke away this opportunity again. They still could make the stage playoffs even if they lose this game, but the Fuel would have to hope that a handful of teams behind them in the standings either lose or finish with a worse map differential. Nothing is guaranteed in this league, but I think you have to like where you're at right now if you're a Fuel fan. All you have to do is beat one of the worst teams in the league and you'll be in a decent position to make your second ever stage playoff appearance. Up next is the Honjo Spark, and this team is probably in one of the most interesting positions out of any of the playoff hopefuls since they currently have a -3 map differential. They're in a very high pressure situation right now because if they beat the Dynasty, then they're in, but if they lose, then there's a high chance they end up missing out. If they wanted to get in at 4-3, then they'll need any team behind them that could potentially finish at 4-3 to either lose their game or to somehow finish with a worse map differential, which probably isn't all that likely, but there's technically still a chance. But the Sparks' fate is in their hands. All they have to do is win this game, and they'll be guaranteed to make the stage playoffs. But if they lose, then who knows what's going to happen to them. The final team that would make stage playoffs if they started today is the Seoul Dynasty. Going 2-0 during the Dallas homestand was a massive help for these guys. A 3-2 record with a +6 map differential is really good. If they can win both of their games this week, then they'll clinch a playoff berth automatically. Unfortunately for Seoul, they have to play the Titans for the second time this stage. The likelihood of them winning this game is pretty small, but they'll have to make sure they don't get blown out in this game so they still have a decent map differential. If they were to beat the Spark and go 4-3 with a decent map differential, then there's still a chance for them. However, there's still a possibility that the Fuel, Dragons, Hunters, and Fusion could finish ahead of them, even if they all go 4-3. So they'll need 3 or more of them to finish with a worse win-loss record or map differential. If these requirements aren't met, then they can kiss their playoff hopes goodbye. There's also a small possibility they could squeak in at 3-4, but they'll need the Dragons, Hunters, Fusion, Uprising, Eternal, and Reign to lose and or have a worse map differential. If the Dynasty are not able to win both of their games, then they're probably going to need at least a few teams to help them out a bit by underperforming this week. Now let's take a look at the teams who are currently in the hunt. Starting off with our current 9th place team, we have the Shanghai Dragons. They would actually be able to make the playoffs if they managed to go 5-2 this stage. But unfortunately, kind of like with the Dynasty, they find themselves in a situation where they have to face a powerhouse team if they want to do that in the Shock. Luckily for them, their other game against the Justice is looking winnable, so if they can beat the Shock, then their chances of actually going 5-2 are really likely. I do think that as long as the Dragons can come out of this week with 1 win, then they should be in a position where stage playoffs is a somewhat realistic outcome. Shanghai is guaranteed to pull ahead of the Spark at the very least if they lose to the Dynasty and the Dragons win at least 1 game, since their map differential is just so much better. It's also more than possible for them to finish in front of teams like the Fuel and Dynasty. They'll need to be pretty lucky if they want that stuff to happen, but it's possible technically. At the same time though, it's pretty possible for just about all of the teams behind them to pass them if the Dragons play poorly this week. Shanghai needs to take care of business and hope that luck is on their side, or their potential first ever playoff appearance is going to be gone. Now we talk about the Chengdu Hunters, and this is yet another team who is just 1 good win away from having a realistic shot of making the playoffs. If the Hunters win their game against the Valiant, then they could be in a decent position to make the playoffs as long as 2 of the teams ahead of them and the Fusion either finish with a worse record or map differential. They could also technically make the stage playoffs at 3-4, but a whole lot more luck would have to be involved, so their chances wouldn't be as good at this point, just like with the last few teams I've talked about. Up next is the playoff hopefuls at the bottom half of the stage standings, where we start things off with the Fusion. These guys are in a very similar boat to the Dragons and Hunters, so I'm going to make this quick for the sake of not being too repetitive. If the Fusion want to make the stage playoffs, then they'll somehow have to find a way to beat the Shock, and 3 of the playoff hopeful teams ahead of them will have to either finish with a worse record or map differential. Losing this game against the Shock would put the Fusion in a really tough spot since they don't have much of a map differential to go off of right now, so an absurd amount of teams both ahead and behind them would have to play horribly this week, so it's basically either win or miss the playoffs. The final team with a somewhat decent shot of making the stage playoffs is the Uprising, and not only do they need to win both of their games to put themselves in a position to do this, but they'll also have to 4-0 both the Gladiators and the Justice if they even want to get their map differential differential back onto the positive side of the spectrum. Not only that, but the Dragons, Hunters, Fusion, then either the Spark, Dynasty, or Fuel are going to have to finish with a worse record than them. So needless to say, this is quite the uphill battle for them. Even just one loss is going to completely eliminate them from playoff contention. Up next, we have the Eternal and the Reign, and they're pretty much in the same position, so I want to talk about both of them simultaneously just to save a little bit of time. So basically, they need everyone from 13th to 8th place in the standings to go 3-4 and finish with a map differential that's somehow, some way worse than theirs, or they're going to be officially eliminated. And as a little bit of a bonus for the Eternal, they also need to watch out for the Valiant because they too could technically finish ahead of them. If the Eternal win their game against the Defiant 3-2 and the Valiant beat the Hunters 4-0 somehow, then I believe, if my math is correct, they would finish with an identical record across the board. Then it more than likely comes down to an offline lane event to decide who ends up higher in the standings. And speaking of the Valiant, they're actually the next team we have to talk about. If they want to make the stage playoffs, then they're first going to have to 4-0 the Hunters, as I just mentioned before. Not only that, but the Dynasty, Dragons, Hunters, Fusion, and Reign are all going to have to lose their games. But wait, there's even more than that. They're also going to need the Uprising to lose at least one of their games, and have the Eternal either lose or win their game against the Defiant 3-2. If the Eternal manage to win by any more than that against Toronto, then they're going to have the better map differential, therefore allowing them to have the better record than the Valiant. And finally, there's the Defiant, which is the team with easily the worst odds of making the playoffs right now. I was honestly kind of surprised to see they were technically still in the race. To start, they're going to have to win their games against the Eternal and the Titans. They'll also need the Dynasty, Dragons, Hunters, and Fusion to lose their games. All other remaining teams ahead of them will also have to either lose or finish with a worse map differential, and the only realistic way that happens is if the Defiant 4-0 both of their opponents. The chances of the Defiant making the playoffs are unbelievably tiny, but I thought I'd bring it up anyway because they technically still are in the playoff race. Well, that's it. There you go, guys. That is what the Overwatch League Stage 2 playoff race is looking like coming into Week 5. A lot of teams actually still have a chance to make it into the playoffs, so this week is going to be very interesting. I apologize if you were lost or if something wasn't really made that clear, by the way. It was very difficult to explain the scenario for each team without taking forever to do so, so if you are confused about something still or have any other questions I was unable to answer in the video, then be sure to leave it down in the comment section. I'm sure that either me or someone else will be able to help you clear any confusion you still have. With that being said, that's pretty much it. What teams do you think have the best chances of making the playoffs or finishing at the top of the standings? Make sure to let me know down in the comment section. If you enjoyed today's content, then I'd very much appreciate it if you could like this video and subscribe if you're new. As always, thank you all so much for watching today's content, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.